Hello, this is part one of resumes under the Rhetoric of Employment Documents. So, some general advice about resumes is that they should be 1 page long. If they get much longer than 1 page, at least 1 page front and back is usually the typical limit. You should definitely not go over 1 page front and back. However, if you're applying for a job and you really want to make a concise, clear statement about yourself, you should keep it to just 1 page front-sided. Some general advice about a resume beyond the page length is that you should not send it to an employer via email unless they ask for it. Now, in class we talked about ways to avoid that problem, such as finding out who the decision makers are and contacting them to say you know they're trying to fill the position quickly and you'd just like to send your information along. That could also, another good reason to contact or email potential employers is to say that you maybe have met them previously or have networked with them in some way. Or another, maybe perhaps most professional way is to share with them a short video of your work or maybe an online portfolio of your professional experiences. And in those cases, it's perfectly fine to include in the email an attachment of your resume so that they can look over it and kind of help you stand out from the rest. So the most important part of a resume, and we've talked about this before, is the idea that the content needs to be concise and very clear and represent you professionally. So designing this document becomes quite important. So in this PowerPoint, I'm going to show you not just the most important content, but also the most important design choices that you can make when it comes to your resume. So the first one, you want to format it in a way that is compact and that highlights your strengths and that is consistent throughout. So for example, if you're going to spell out the word Minnesota because you had previous work experience in Minnesota, then you spell it out completely, or you use the acronym MN. You need to make a strong choice about that and keep it consistent throughout. We'll talk more about consistency, especially when it comes to design. In resume design, you want everything to remain in a consistent hierarchy. So your font sizes, your font colors, your bullets, and any kind of indentations that you're using, and section headers should all be consistent. The most important thing to remember when it comes to resume design is that skimming layer of reading. The resume is the most skimmed document you could possibly imagine as far as professional documents go. So the idea is to create visual emphasis, usually using bold and different font sizes in order to call attention to important elements. So font size is important in establishing hierarchy in the document. So your name should be the biggest in terms of size, and then the heading should be the second biggest, and on down the line. Descriptions should all be consistent in terms of the title of your position, the name of the company, and your list of responsibilities for each job. That should all have the same font size. In terms of font color, you really shouldn't be using a font color other than black when it comes to a resume. Again, they want to see that you can write a professional document, and unless you're applying for a job that's very design oriented, you want to stay somewhat traditional in this document. In regard to bolding is a very useful tool in helping you highlight major areas of your resume. However, you don't want to use bold too much. It's fine to emphasize a few main phrases or perhaps the title of your degree or the university where you went or the company that you've worked for in your work experience. However, if you're doing a lot of bolding throughout, it can be distracting at some point. The same goes with caps or italics or underlining. Those kind of harken back to typewriter forms of design, and so I think people today look at that as being potentially antiquated. You want to set yourself apart and make sure you look professional in terms of today's standards. So it's a good idea to mostly avoid italics, underlining, or caps. In terms of resume parts, the most essential part begins with the header. So that's the top of the page where your name is highlighted. And I thought it would be useful to look at these 3 different examples. Again, this is from our online textbook. Notice how the first example looks very traditional, almost, again, like harkening back to a typewriter style. Since the font that is being used on graphic style number 3 is a more computer style font, web-based font. And that's perfectly fine, but you should make that decision based on the rhetorical situation of your particular job. If you know you're applying for a more traditional company, it's probably better to go with graphic style like number 2. If you know that your company is a bit more contemporary, maybe like Amazon.com or Zappos, you should definitely think about using a web-based font like number 3. The next part of your resume is the objective. It's important to keep that somewhat general. People don't usually adapt the objective to every single job because you want the potential employer to know what your overall goal is. It's probably not your only goal to work at that company. So to keep it brief, for example, if you're applying to a job at Fifth Third Bank, you might say to obtain a career in the finance industry or in the banking industry. You might not say, to obtain a job at Fifth Third Bank. After that section comes education, where you should list your degree, your major, and your university. And usually it's listed somewhat like this: Bachelor of Arts in English Education, Purdue University, and then you should include your expected graduation date. And one thing that's always debated is, should you include your GPA? And the idea is, include your GPA if it's very stellar, and if not, don't include it. So if you have a GPA, that's over 3.5 or 3.4, that's something that potential employers may want to see. Otherwise, you don't have to emphasize it in your resume. After the education section, you should list your most relevant work experience. Again, the idea here is to create consistency. So the job title is typically listed first, followed by the name of your employer, in other words, Fifth Third Bank, if we're using that example, and then your dates of employment. And that doesn't have to be written out, in a actual date. You can just use the years that you worked there, and that's perfectly fine. And the next thing, and this is probably the most important part, is a bullet-pointed list of your responsibilities. We want to know why it is that what it is that you did in that job, how, and what skills you gained while you did it. This section should always be listed in reverse chronological order. So in terms of your relevant work experience, you should list your most frequent job first and move backwards in time. And when you're listing the responsibilities, the most important thing is that everything is parallel. Again, this has to do with the consistency in design, but what I mean when I say parallel, I'm actually using that term to refer to the grammar in your list of responsibilities. So for instance, it's not parallel to say that you were serving customers, cash register, and clearing tables. Instead, you'd want to make sure every sentence starts with the same verb in the same verb tense. Usually that tense should be present tense. So, serving customers, working the cash register, and clearing tables. You also want to be careful about repeating information or putting somewhat superficial information on its own line. You want to combine information that's not new and try to provide the same information in the same order for each of your job experiences. So in other words, parallelism doesn't just refer to grammar in this case, it also refers to logic. So for instance, if you were to write something like serving customers, being friendly and courteous, and working well with others, it's really not necessary to list all of those things separately. So who are you being friendly and courteous to? Well, you're being friendly and courteous to customers. So a revised version might be serving customers in a friendly and courteous manner and helping team to meet performance measures. So now you can watch part 2 of the resume section where I overview an example student resume and show you some of the feedback that I gave to that student.